Okay, so this was research I conducted for my dissertation that I just finished. So I worked in Yunnan province, China, and I was there for about a year and a half, over 3 years.
Can
The microphone work, is that on?
Let me know if you still can't hear me. My voice can be quiet, so stay close to me. How do you use this?
It's on the side.
So, as I was just saying, I worked in Yunnan province, China, which is a fabulous place to work if you're an ethnobotanist or a botanist or a zoologist. So, really, you should go there. I strongly suggest it. It's known for its cultural diversity and its biodiversity, and it's about the size of California. I work in the northwest corner of that province, in Dali Prefecture, Lijiang Prefecture, Liqing Prefecture, and Nujing Prefecture. Now, this province borders Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, so you have a wealth of knowledge and cultures in this area. It's especially known for its rhododendron, and there are about 250 species of rhododendron in Yunnan province. So it's a huge, huge place for diversity and is a center of diversity for rhododendron. It's also really amazing for cultural diversity. Here you see some examples from Tibetan ethnic group, mostly in Shangri-La, which is where I was working, partially. But there are 25 different ethnic minorities in Yunnan province. So it's really great if you want to look at the intersection of biodiversity and cultural diversity, which is what I did, especially for rhododendron. So I'm going to go through pieces of my dissertation here. The first question that I looked at was, do ethnic groups in Yunnan province use rhododendron? And then I built on this question with some further sub-questions. But let's first see how ethnic groups in China use rhododendron. I'm just going to talk about a couple of examples here, otherwise it'd be going on for a while. But first let's talk about my field methods. For this I just did some semi-structured interviews where I asked 10 different questions related to rhododendron. So I asked, for example, can you eat rhododendron? How do you process this if you eat it? Can you use rhododendron for wood or in handicrafts? Can you use rhododendron in religion? So I tried to keep these questions very open-ended so that I didn't miss anything, so that I could get anything about rhododendron that people knew. I had these questions as yes or no questions, but I also had open-ended questions so that I could get more details about them. And the yes or no question part I use a little bit later, and I'll talk about it more. I tried to ask 30 different individuals in each ethnic minority, and I talked to 7 ethnic minorities and the Han majority in specific locations. So some uses that I found out. So can you use rhododendron wood? Yes, you can use rhododendron wood. And this was one of the most popular responses of uses. So rhododendron in China can grow to be gigantic trees, so huge trees that are perfect for using the wood. So these bowls are from the E ethnic minority. They're lacquered in a specific way for their culture, and they're made for sale and for personal use. There's also Tibetan people who use rhododendron wood. And we have Tibetan yak butter tea churners. Yak butter tea is drank very commonly by Tibetans. It's really delicious, and you use that tea churner to make it. There's also bowls made by Tibetans, handicrafts of all different kinds. You can also make saddles from larger pieces of wood. A huge number of handicrafts from rhododendron wood. Then you can eat rhododendron, which is amazing because rhododendron can be toxic from grams. So first, before you eat rhododendron, you need to soak it in water for several days, which you can see on that far picture. It's rhododendron corolla from rhododendron decorum, soaking in water. Then you can eat rhododendron after you've processed it and soaked it in water for several days. There I have it cooking with potatoes, which I made that dish myself. Tastes like potatoes, not so much anything else. You can also eat it as a soup, mixed with broad beans, mixed with meat, several different other ways. And I have some recipes if you're interested. And then there are religious uses. So we have the Naxi ethnic minority in Lijiang province and Lijiang prefecture. And they frequently use rhododendron in their religious practices. So for example, Naxi people in one specific area really disliked rhododendron with white flowers because for them white signifies death and rhododendrons are toxic. So they especially didn't like white rhododendrons to be around them at all. Additionally, rhododendron leaves, even though they don't like rhododendron, especially the white ones, they can use rhododendron leaves as a type of incense to get rid of spirits in their house. So they'll walk around with rhododendron leaves, and I've seen them do it and get rid of bad spirits to cleanse their house. Additionally, they have some types of sayings that kind of go along with the religious uses that talk about the beauty of rhododendron, but the toxicity inside of rhododendron. So if a woman is called rhododendron, it means they're beautiful on the outside, but toxic on the inside. So it's not about they do not want to be called a rhododendron. In other cultures, it's high, but not so much with Naxi. And then there are some Tibetan stories. So here are some Tibetan women dancing in Shangri-La, which that area is unfortunately no longer there because there was a fire recently. But Tibetan stories are from a specific location near Shangri-La. There's a nature preserve and a lake, and rhododendrons grow very commonly around this lake. And when the rhododendron coral was dropped into the water, they temporarily poison the fish, which then float to the surface. And bears come down from the mountain and eat all of the fish. But however, they are unaffected. So, keeping in mind all of those uses from rhododendron, and there are even more uses that I can't go into today, but keeping in mind those uses about rhododendron, I looked at, do ethnic groups who frequently come in contact with each other, do they exchange this knowledge about rhododendron? So I had those 10 questions, and I used all of those 10 questions to look further at this knowledge exchange. And then, do ethnic groups have heterogeneous responses to interview questions? So the first question is looking among ethnic groups, and the second question really focusing in on each individual ethnic group that I worked with. So there's a really large body of literature looking at, do ethnic groups exchange knowledge when they come in contact with each other? And some literature says, yes, they do. And others say, no, they don't. So I wanted to use these two hypotheses and see, do these ethnic groups that I specifically worked with exchange knowledge about rhododendron, or do they keep it separate? And are there any different factors that play in, other than just being in contact with each other? And then I also thought that ethnic groups who have heterogeneous responses to interview questions may be less culturally cohesive. So they have different knowledge about other things as well. So let's take a look at the ethnic groups that I worked with. I worked with the Bai, which is a minority, and the Han, which is a majority. These ethnic groups I focused on in one specific location so that they could be related to each other. And Han, obviously, is the majority, so you can't think that Han everywhere had this exact same knowledge, and I'm not implying that. Just these Han interviewees in this specific region who live with the Bai people. Then we have the Dulong Misu Inu, who live up by Myanmar in a very rural area. And then we have the Naxi Tibetan Innu. And let's take a little look at where they're specifically living. So in Dali Prefecture, I interviewed Bai people and Han people in specific locations where they were together. In Nujang Prefecture, which is right by Myanmar, I worked with the Dulong Misu Inu. Now these ethnic groups are pretty small and can sometimes speak each other's languages, or at least understand each other's languages because they're related. And then I interviewed Tibetan in Dicheng Prefecture, and Yi and Naxi people in different locations of Lijiang Prefecture. So for data analysis, I used those exact same interviews to get the detailed knowledge that I learned about uses of rhododendron. But with the yes and no questions, I got pretty basic answers. So yes, maybe, or no. Using those yes, maybe, or no answers, I coded them as 0, 1, and 0.5. And I went through all of the questions and all of the interviews to do that, so it took a while. And using those Excel files, I used the program Primer 6 to get some cluster analysis information where you can look to see if there's mixing of this knowledge about rhododendron or if there's differences in this knowledge between those ethnic groups. And I compared different ethnic groups depending on where they were living or the similarities and differences. So I compared the Bai with the Han, because that was specifically testing one specific paper by Carolyn Wetherly, and she thought that they do share knowledge. So Bai and Han were specific in that one location. Then Dulong and Lisu and Nu I compared together because they were living in Mujiang Prefecture, and they talked to each other, they could speak each other's language, they shared markets, and they shared a lot of knowledge. So I compared those three ethnic groups. And then I compared the Naxi, the Tibetan, and the Yi ethnic groups. They were living separately in different locations of either the same prefecture or separate prefectures. And then for a second analysis, again to look within a specific ethnic group, if people in that ethnic group shared the same knowledge. I did a different analysis called the cultural cohesion, which basically I used those same Excel files, but for each ethnic group, added up all of the yes answers, and then divided that by the total number of answers. So again, I had 10 questions. If an ethnic group said yes to 5 questions, so it's 5 divided by 10, and then turn that into a percentage. And then percentages of 10% and under and 70% and above were highlighted. And I counted those highlighted pieces to see how many cultural cohesion units they had. So let's take a look at the cluster analysis. So the among ethnic group discussion. So for figure 1, I have the Nu, the Dulong, and Lisu. Again, those are the groups that were living together. And you can see at star 1 and star 2, all of the ethnic groups in those polytomy areas are sharing knowledge. So each person in that polytomy area of star 1 has the exact same answer to questions. So all 10 questions, exact same answers. So they're sharing knowledge. And then we have the Tibetan, the Yi, and the Naxi. So if you look at star 1 or star 2 and elsewhere in figure 2, you can see that the Tibetan, the Yi, and the Naxi are keeping their knowledge about rhododendron separate. And then if you look at figure 3, specifically just with the Bai and the Han, you can see throughout there are different places where Bai and Han people are answering questions exactly the same. So all those 10 questions answering exactly the same. And then for cultural cohesion, so looking specifically within each ethnic group, you can see that I've highlighted to make it a little bit easier to read, that the number of cultural cohesion units of the Dulong, the Naxi, the Tibetan, and the Yi have higher than 5 cultural cohesion units, 4 or 5. So this says that maybe they're all sharing knowledge. Maybe the knowledge about rhododendron they have is shared in their ethnic group. Does that make sense? So the Dulong, they, as you can see, if you look a little bit more in depth with the Dulong, you have a lot of zeros and a lot of very low numbers. So they're sharing a lot of no responses. So they didn't have a lot of knowledge about rhododendron in general. They have a lot of no responses. But if you look at the Naxi, they have some, especially with religion and horticulture and tourism, they share a lot of the same knowledge about rhododendron. And it's a lot of positive answers about rhododendron. So all 8 ethnic groups had knowledge about rhododendron, even the dugong that did have some no responses. And then all ethnic groups who frequently come in contact with each other, they do share knowledge. So the Bai and the Han share knowledge with each other, and they've been living together in this one region of Yunnan province in Dali Prefecture. They've been living together for a very long time. And then the Lisu, the Nu, and the Dulong have also share a lot of knowledge about rhododendron because they're living together, they frequently intermarry, they can speak each other's languages. And the Nakshi, Tibetan, and the Yi, they have separate knowledge about rhododendron. They live apart and they don't typically share that knowledge. And the Nakshi, the Tibetan, and the Yi people are culturally cohesive. They, within their ethnic group, share knowledge about rhododendron within them. And that's all I have for you today. And if I have time, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Very good. So we have got time for a couple of questions if anyone's got questions.
I was wondering, how did you choose those thresholds for the cultural cohesion? Because I thought it was interesting that the yeses were above 70, but the nos were below 10, so they were inverse of each other? So I didn't know if you had like...
So I go into it like really in depth in the paper.
I bet.
It might be a little bit long to explain now, but for the final thing for 5 to get the cutoff, not for the 10 or the 7, but for 5 was half. So it made sense to do 5 as your threshold, and then 10 is the mean. I do go into it. I don't know if that happens. Yeah.
Well, we could always talk
Yeah.
more.
Dan?
Anyone else?
I wondered, how do you distinguish, it seems like there's 2 different kinds of sharing. One is that they have the same knowledge, I mean, yes, I use rhododendron wood, I mean, who wouldn't in that environment? And the other would be, well, we exchange this knowledge. Is there any way to distinguish between those 2?
You mean between the within the ethnic group and the among the ethnic groups?
No, I'm talking about among.
Okay.
And I'm talking about the definition of, because you did, or maybe I misunderstood, did you look at how different, when you did the cluster analysis, you were looking at how much they shared knowledge?
Yes.
So it seemed to me that there was a distinction between having the same uses and actually sharing knowledge.
So the sharing,
Do you mind if I
the
sign
question
that
answers,
after?
I included all 10 questions and compared the exact answers with everybody else. So not everybody used wood, for example. Seriously, yeah. Yeah, so not everybody used wood. And then if you look at that, those cluster analysis compared with the cultural cohesion, you could see exactly how many people were using rhododendron for wood. So if you like go across that.
Right, no, I understand the analysis. I just was trying to figure out if there was a way to distinguish actually having the same use and
I looked at the detailed
and
answers.
shared knowledge.
I looked at the detailed answers. So if somebody, I had the yes and no, but I also had the, yes, I use it for this. And that's what I looked at. So it
Thank
took
you.
a lot of looking.
Thank you again.